Hey, useful idiots. We did the show live this week, and you can check it out over at youtube.com/usefulidiots. Here's this week's interview with Ryan Grimm.
Very excited to have joining us today Ryan Grimm, who is the DC Bureau Chief at the Intercept. He's also the author of We've Got People. You can find him on Twitter at Ryan Grimm. He's the host of the Deconstructed podcast. He's also on The Hills Rising, and he's done a lot of great coverage of reconciliation, the Squad, Assange, as Aaron Mate says, Assange.
Right, with a little French kind of, yeah. All right, let's talk to Ryan.
Let's do it. Thank you so much, Ryan, for joining us. Welcome. This is your debut. Big things are going to happen. Big things coming up.
That's right. I couldn't be any more exciting.
So first,
I bet you could. I bet
impossible. Impossible. I have some pumpkin spice espresso bean things, so maybe they'll get me like really jacked up.
Yeah.
Trader Joe's pumpkin spice espresso beans.
Oh, that sounds actually kind of good. Well, this interview is going to be almost exciting as Trader Joe's pumpkin spice espresso beans, if you can imagine. But wanted to ask you where we are in this entire infrastructure reconciliation. I believe the technical word is mishigas. Where we are in the process, where we're going, what the timeline is, what people can expect, any insights you have, because this is something you've really been covering.
Maybe we're at the beginning of the fourth quarter, something like right around there.
That means nothing to Katie.
It means we're closing in on the end of the game, I think. I actually think that November 2nd, which is the Virginia gubernatorial election, ought to be something that Democrats are taking extremely seriously as a deadline for getting it done, just in case Terry McAuliffe manages to faceplant and lose to the Trump-backed guy in that state. Because if he does, then you could see a scenario where the wheels just completely come off and everybody just starts, running for cover and the whole thing falls apart. You could see a scenario where he loses and they're like, well, now we really need to pass this. So, but it's a huge wild card, and right now they're on a glide path towards passing it. So they should just do it. Right now the fight is what is the price tag going to say publicly? And Manchin the other day was asked if he was cool with Joe Biden's offer of putting it between 1.9 and 2.2 trillion, and he said nothing's off the table. A lot of this is meaningless because it really depends on how much of it is front loaded and what programs are in it. But it's easier, I think, for the media to talk about numbers like that than it is to kind of talk more expansively about what's in it. Because once one side is asking for 3.5 trillion and the other side is asking for 1.5 trillion, it's pretty clear roughly where you're going to end up. And the media can get its head around that.
Really? Because if this were 10 years ago, I would 100% assume that it would end up at 1.5 trillion.
Oh, right. That's true, though. If one side is just two people and the other side is the rest of the party, then I think that explains why it's likely to end up, around 2. So still closer to the two people and further away from where the 48 want it to be.
I get that that's the way things are going, but why is that? Like a year ago, the entire party was, circling the wagons to make sure that Bernie didn't get get the nomination, and you had every wonk in Washington whispering to every reporter about how irresponsible things like free college were, and now we got 2 years of community college in this bill, and everybody's acting like it's a given that that's what everybody wants. Am I missing something? Was there a big change of heart?
I think part of it is that the establishment wants to remain in power, and as long as it's them, that's fine with them. Hugo Chavez had this funny quote where he was like, "I saw a revolution coming, and it was either going to wipe me out or I was going to carry out a revolution. So I figured I'd rather carry out a revolution." And so he did. and he preferred to be the revolutionary than the revolutioned. Now, that's not to say that Chuck Schumer is a modern day.
It's just so
Hugo,
not in the
Hugo
DNA
Chavez.
of these people.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
It is the DNA of them to stay in positions of power at all costs.
See, this was my fantasy that I didn't think was happening, and this is what I hoped would happen, which was that Bernie being in the race would make things that were before considered fantasy pipe dreams, right? Rainbows and puppies or whatever Ezra Klein called it. He would normalize those things. Like he would make it no longer a fringe thing to demand, and he would make it so that it's outrageous that we don't have certain things, and that unlike with Obama, when Obama came in and people had high hopes about Obama had defeated Hillary Clinton. It wasn't like he was coming off of battling someone who was asking for so much more than he asked for.
Mhm.
So I wonder how much of that is that effect.
No, I think from like a narrative and from a messaging perspective that he very much did accomplish that feat, that the things that Biden is proposing are closer, much closer to what Bernie was proposing than they are to like what, you know, Joe Biden of his entire career would have been proposing. And that was made possible by Sanders expanding what was thought of as okay to say in politics. But you still have the structural obstacles that you can't defeat just with messaging. What the messaging win does is it allows you to talk publicly about those things in a serious way and have MSNBC and CNN and the New York Times kind of treat them seriously. But then you have to overcome the structural obstacles like the fossil fuel industry being, you know, powerful incumbent that has a say in these things, the drug industry, you know, that has a say in these things. But once you're having that fight in public, it's a winnable fight. Like there's a good chance that the pharmaceutical industry loses this fight. Also a good chance that they come in at the last minute with a tweak or two that we find out a month later they inserted into the bill that allows the rule makers to, you know, completely gut what they tried to do. So, you know, but it's a live fight.
You mean in terms of like negotiating Medicare
right
prices for drugs and that sort of thing?
Right. And they've won this fight before where they thought they had,
like, over and over again. They've won it.
They've won it before, even after they lost. Like there was this moment that David Sirota was talking about this recently. I forget exactly when it happened, but they basically won. Like the Sanders, this was when Sanders was a congressman, they won. And then Pharma had gotten a tweak into the law that they hadn't noticed that Donna Shalala then used when she was HHS secretary to basically write a rule that handed the win right back to Pharma. So you can never rule them out. And Democrats have an incentive to claim a victory that isn't a victory. Like if they can say, hey, we saved $700 billion by allowing Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices. Now we're going to spend that $700 billion, extending the child tax credit. It'll be fine to plenty of Democrats if that's a lie. Like if they didn't actually save $700 billion from drug makers, and drug makers figure out, the next week how to win that back, because at least they got to extend the child tax credit with the lie of this kind of offset money. So there are some incentives lining up that Pharma can exploit if they do it right. So the idea of actually getting lower drug prices, which Democrats have been running on now for a couple cycles, like that's been almost all of their ads in swing districts. Elect us and we will protect pre-existing conditions and we will lower drug prices. Like those are basically their two promises. And the only one that they need to actively do something on is lowering drug prices. So we'll see if they actually do it. But it's a live fight. The pharmaceutical industry is scared and spending a lot of money, and they might lose. Like that's a new and weird development.
Another thing that I know Matt has been very, I don't know why I'm speaking for Matt, he's right here, but Matt, you keep looking at this with a lot of justified suspicion. Like, why are people backing these things when they spent their entire primary trying to obliterate or marginalize Bernie Sanders? The other question I think that you've raised is how much of this is really Manchin and Sinema versus how much of this is something that maybe Biden even wants? Like, how much are these what is it called? The rotating villains? What political, do they serve a political purpose in being the faces, the bad guys?
The problem with if they are doing a rotating villain strategy, they're really getting down to the end of the line with it, because they're down to 2 villains. Now we're finishing up a piece now about how Bob Menendez, speaking of villains, is not sold. He's not on board 100% for the drug pricing stuff yet. He's from New Jersey, which is the big pharma capital of the country. He almost went to prison for corruption, where he was bribed by a Medicare fraudster, who basically paid him to make sure that he could keep ripping Medicare off, and somehow wound up with a hung jury and didn't get prosecuted again. So he's still a free man, and he's still serving in the United States Senate. So he kind of owes Schumer a lot, because Schumer backed him after, good Lord. I mean, even after he nearly went to prison for this corruption scandal. He won re-election.
Should be pointed out, he nearly went to prison for a different corruption scandal than the one he was originally accused of.
Which one did he finally? Man. Which one did he finally get tried
the one that
for?
you were talking about. The original one was the underage.
Oh yes, there was that one. There was that scandal.
Right, but the one was used to leverage the.
That's right.
Into the other. So
yes, that's right. But so he could become a rotating villain. He's pharma's biggest defender in either the House or Senate, because there's so much focus on Manchin and Sinema. If Democrats bring them along, it's very hard to see a last minute villain popping up that Democrats can't handle.
So is Biden doing anything, do you think, behind the scenes to pressure Manchin and Sinema?
It doesn't seem like he's doing a ton. And knowing Joe Biden's kind of lobbying and negotiating skills, it's not obvious that him doing a lot would be that super helpful. He's not terribly good at that. Now, being president comes with it this ephemeral power he now holds, since he sits in that office. There's a section in Bob Woodward's book. He doesn't end at the January 6th. He does the first couple months of the Biden administration.
Does he write himself in not telling people that Donald Trump admitted to downplaying?
He should. That'd be a great blow by blow to have from him. I don't think he did. I haven't read the whole book. I read the Biden parts, but there's a scene where Biden calls Joe Manchin when Joe Manchin is getting flaky on the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan from like February, March, where he was, saying he was going to hold it up over all these different things about unemployment that he didn't like, which is what he talks about all the time. He doesn't want to create this entitlement mentality.
He worked so hard.
And Biden just keeps saying to him, Joe, you're going to take my fucking bill down. You're going to destroy my fucking presidency. It's almost like he's just there's a string on him, because he just keeps saying the exact, like everything that Manchin says to him, Biden answers with, you're going to take my fucking bill down. What are you doing? And Manchin just keeps saying, I'm not going to take your bill down. Don't worry. I'm not going to take your bill down. But I promised Portman. I promised him. He keeps bringing up Portman and these promises he made to Portman. Portman is an underappreciated power player still. Portman is very smart. He was George W. Bush's budget director, and he's in Manchin's ear about this bill. And so he's making sure to tell Manchin, and this is what I've heard from sources in the Senate, that like, hey, progressives are going to try to roll you in all of these different ways with all of these different gimmicks. One thing they're going to try to do is, shorten the length of these programs, so it'll still actually be a giant $3.5 trillion thing, but it'll look like two. You can't fall for that. And so Manchin has told people he's not going to fall for things like that. So it is
fall for the banana in the tailpipe.
He's not going to fall for that one. There's still a lot of wild cards left, and Manchin and Sinema both are big ones. But the language that he keeps putting out is, we're going to get to a deal, and he wants the corporate tax changes made. He wants he's just really bitter. Like so Li Fang got audio of him meeting with No Labels back in June, which is the dark money group that's like financing a lot of these like anti-tax increase on the rich measures. And Manchin told this story about how he was ready to vote for Trump's tax cuts, but he had like a series of little amendments that he wanted included. And at the last minute, McConnell came to him and was like, he's like, Joe, we've got 50 votes. We don't need you. We're not going to put your amendments in. And Manchin is extremely bitter about that because he wanted to make it bipartisan. He wanted to give Trump, he wanted to vote for Trump on the tax cuts, and he wanted to get his own little tweaks in there for whatever pet projects he had, whatever industries he was trying to boost. Quid pro Joe is like his nickname back in West Virginia. And so he said, because of that, I want to open up the tax reform again. And he wants to screw McConnell back for not letting him play along. So he's
It's hard not to understand that.
Yeah. So he's motivated on that. He said he's good with the drug pricing stuff. He's fine with child tax credit, though. He wants to narrow who can get it. That's his whole thing. He wants to means test everything more strictly than it is. Then you get to Sinema, who does this big song and dance about how she can't be pressured. Don't even try to pressure me because it only makes me stronger. But as she's been under pressure, all she's done is released a series of like increasingly defensive statements, which suggest just the opposite, that she's actually feeling the pressure. And I feel like her only way out of this politically and professionally is to come to a deal. Like, she's so botched the entire thing from a PR perspective. Her numbers are so terrible in Arizona that she has no capital left to tank the whole thing, and that she would destroy herself, because she can't be a Democratic lobbyist if the Democratic Party hates her. Like, if all of the senators blame her for taking down their crowning legislative achievement, like the thing that they spend decades trying to be chair of the EPW committee or whatever, and then finally they get to divvy out a couple $1 trillion, and it all goes down because of this woman. And now she wants to meet on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry. Like, no, I'm not taking that meeting. And so if you don't have warm relationships with your former colleagues, you can't cash out on those relationships. So she's screwing herself professionally and politically. And I think the only way out is if she comes to some type of terms, because then people are like, okay, fine. You fought hard and all's fair. But
she could also switch parties.
She could. There's the Arlen Specter, which, he switched parties in 2009, and then he lost in a primary in 2010. Because the base of the Democratic Party was like, we're glad that you switched and voted for our stuff for a year, but you still suck. And so Sinema would face that challenge in a Republican primary. Will she acknowledge that Trump legitimately won the election in 2020 and that it was stolen from him? And if not, you're not winning an Arizona Republican Senate primary.
Right.
Now, she could I wouldn't put it past her, going there.
Or go independent, do the Lieberman thing.
That would be interesting. Hope that some crazy Republican gets 30% and that she can win it with 40. That's a possibility. The easier possibility is just keep Democrats happy in a state that's becoming increasingly Democratic.
Did you see, Wilson, can we just click on that tweet that I put into the chat? This is from Axios. Kristen Sinema's allies have some free advice for anyone trying to bully the wine-drinking triathlete into supporting Biden's $3.5 trillion budget bill. She doesn't play by Washington rules, and she's prepared to walk away. And that's above an image of her riding a bicycle, wearing pink gloves, pink sneakers, pink tank top, pink piped shorts. Very good.
Feels like that would be a long bike ride from DC back to Arizona.
She's a triathlete. She could do it.
Yeah, she is a triathlete. Yeah.
So Kyrsten Sinema's allies. Kyrsten Sinema? What allies? Clearly, the people that spoke to her were like, you can call us Kyrsten Sinema's allies. So there are two possibilities for who those quote allies could be, and only one of them is serious. Her staff. like
Right.
coming directly from the staff. The second would be Republican senators. If it's Republican senators, it's not worth pixels. It's tweeted on because they want to tank. They don't want pressure on Sinema. They want the whole thing to go down. If it's her staff, it's also ridiculous. Don't pressure me. I'm just going to get stronger. After she put this message out, then she followed it up with this defensive statement saying it's false to say that I haven't shared my concerns about the bill. I have been negotiating in good faith. Both Schumer and Biden know what I want out of this bill. And she has in the days since continued to talk about how she's negotiating in good faith. And every time you're forced publicly to say that you're negotiating in good faith, you're losing more credibility.
What's her real ask in this whole thing? Does she have one? Do we know what it is?
Actual real ask so far are reducing the price tag. Like she said, I won't do 3.5 trillion.
Just because, or
just because, yeah, just because.
This is a budget thing. Or?
Too much, yeah. And she has said she's concerned about the corporate tax increases and the personal tax increases on the rich, which is connected to the spending part. Basically, she doesn't like the whole thing, but she has said repeatedly that she wants to do all of the climate stuff in it. And otherwise, though, she hasn't really said anything specific other than she doesn't like any of it.
And who are she and Manchin beholden to? Which special interests?
Manchin is most beholden. I think Manchin's, too compromised on pharmaceutical stuff because of his daughter at Mylan. And he's on record now. He's like, I'm fine with the drug price stuff. But Manchin is most beholden to the coal industry, of which he is a player in. We had a story that looked into, in fact, he's made $4.5 million from his own coal empire since becoming a senator. So he makes 3 or 4 times more a year from coal production every year than he makes in his Senate salary. So he's actually a coal producer. And of course,
big carbon footprint from him.
There's also a lot of natural gas money in West Virginia that influences him, as well as just rich people in general who don't want any increases in corporate tax rates or personal income tax rates. But he's willing to do that, like we said, because out of spite for Trump and out of spite for McConnell. But what's ironic about the whole thing is that they're not really talking about a significant tax increase here. We're talking about just returning it back to what it was, which is kind of funny because it means if Trump had never cut taxes, Democrats would probably not be proposing trillions of dollars in new spending, even though that makes no sense. If you could do it at a 39.6% personal income tax rate on the rich and at the corporate rate that was prevailing before Trump lowered it, if you can spend the money by moving the tax rates back to that, then you could spend the money if the tax rates were never lowered. But Democrats are still not, I don't think, at a place where they could push that and say, we're just not gonna, we're gonna do $3 trillion and we're not gonna offset it with any tax increases. They're not there. So they need this kind of weird whiplash of, well, we're gonna cut taxes in 2017 and then we're gonna raise them back up in 2021. And while we raise them back up, we're gonna create these new social programs, which if that's how it winds up, that's okay.
It all kind of, it makes sense as long as, here's sort of my unified field theory about what's happening here. Like, let's say this was 15 years ago or 20 years ago, this same scenario was playing out. The Democratic Party would never be choosing to stick it to the pharmaceutical industry, the fossil fuel industry, and the top bracket, tax brackets, just willy-nilly. They wouldn't do it. Like they've refused to do it repeatedly ever since Clinton came around. What gives them theoretically the freedom to do it this time is because in the last couple of election cycles, Trump has been the opponent, and a lot of those voting blocks haven't had a real alternative. In other words, they're not gonna lose those people in the rich suburbs in New Jersey and Western Virginia or whatever it is to the Republicans by doing this. But is that a correct premise going forward? In other words, like I think it's fine, a great idea if they actually do this. Like, in other words, they're calculating that we can afford to offend our highest earning members of our coalition right now because we have the political capital to do it. Let's spend a little bit of it. But is that a correct assumption, I guess, is what I'm asking you. Like, is that all based on the idea that Trump is going to be the nominee again, or
I think it's correct if they can get through the more universal program approach that they're trying to do. So which Manchin is trying to slice to pieces. So Manchin could totally screw them politically on this question. Like, there's a reason that these swing district suburban Democrats are far more supportive. Even these new Democrats, it's wild. Like, the new Democrat coalition is like on board for this whole thing. It's just a few renegades like Gottheimer that are against it, because their constituents actually, if this version of it goes through, benefit, because a lot of people that are living in the suburbs are, they don't feel great in this precarious climate and this precarious economy. And so if they can get an extra $250 or $500 a month in child tax credits, if they can get childcare subsidized so that it becomes actually affordable to them, because you can make a couple $100,000 a year in these suburbs, and it still doesn't mean that you can afford $3,000 to $4,000 a month in childcare.
No, nobody can. That's the whole thing. Yeah.
Right. And so if they can so their thinking is, if we can tax people who are making more than $400,000, and actually only taxing on the money above 400,000, and we raise the corporate tax rate to pay for this stuff, and the benefits flow out to the middle class people in the suburbs, then that could be a political winner for us. So they think that they're not actually kind of costing them, because it's the 1% that they're hitting less than the top 20%. Like, they're trying to be nice to the top 20%. And because you have so much more inequality today than you had even 15, 20 years ago. So there's that much more wealth up the top that you can tap to then transfer down to the top 20%. But Manchin, first of all, he comes from West Virginia. So if you means test things much lower, it still gets pretty widely distributed around West Virginia. And so if he succeeds in cutting, millions of people out of a lot of the benefits, then I don't think the calculation keeps working. Unless, like you said, they keep nominating nut jobs, then who knows? But that's a huge gamble, because one of two things could happen. One, one of the nut jobs eventually wins, like actually just happened 2016. Right. Or they nominate somebody who's a nut job but doesn't seem like such a nut job, and then they just clean up in the suburbs.
Well, and especially in fundraising. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, that's what's just so weird to me about this whole reconciliation bill. I'm having a hard time accepting it logically, because it just goes against.
This might help. So Schumer has very much recognized the power of suburban small donors, the wine moms, whatever you want to call them, who have a more disposable income than a lot of Bernie's small donors. Like, Bernie still managed to raise, a couple $100 million, and that was enough to get Chuck Schumer's attention. Like, oh, that's a lot of money. But then once these Senate candidates in 2018 around the country were absolutely flush with cash, because people in the suburbs were giving each candidate $50. Schumer's operation would say, here's 12 candidates that we need money for. And then there'd be people who'd give $25, $50 to every single one of them. And they would do it every single time Rachel Maddow got them mad on the TV. They'd send another $50 to the Iowa candidate, or here's $50 to whoever's running against Susan Collins. And the guy in North Carolina cheating on his wife, here's $100 because he's going to need it. And so when Schumer saw that that you could raise hundreds of millions and over a couple of years, billions of dollars from these donors. Then what he started reasoning, and he's talked to people about this, was that you have to give them something. Like, you're going to lose those people if they feel like they wasted their what ends up being $2,000, because it really starts to add up. So he's like, we need to be seen fighting. We need these people to understand that they got something by electing us. That, I think, is how the money in politics explanation works for Schumer.
I get it. Okay, that's interesting.
He's just whoever's got the money.
Well, clearly, Bernie raising all that money in the 2020 cycle was like probably one of the biggest political stories of last couple of years, right? I mean, it kind of completely altered how politicians across the spectrum look at the whole process of running for office.
Right. You just can't laugh at Dennis Kucinich anymore.
Right.
Like,
right.
You got to watch out.
Right. Yeah.
Department of Peace coming at you.
That's right.
Or more to the point, Trump, right? Like, I mean, just because someone's nuts or whatever it is, like, they doesn't mean that they can't bypass the usual Brahmins to get elected now.
Right.
But
right.
what you're suggesting is that the Schumers of the world are starting to think out of the box a little bit and realizing that rather than going to some bank in Lower Manhattan and bundling a whole bunch of money all at once, that you can get an equivalent amount of money from, an appeal to suburban donors or whatever it is.
Right.
Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah. Yeah. And you can arguably raise more, because at some point there's a finite number of those bankers that are going to come to a Chuck Schumer fundraiser. It costs money to do it. It costs time to do it. It costs political capital to do it, because you have to do things that are unpopular.
Right.
In order to make them happy.
Phone calls.
You have to answer their phone calls. You have to give their kids internships.
Right.
It's complete mess.
Even the ones you don't want to have sex with.
Even them. Even them. It really doesn't matter. All of them. Whereas you don't ever have to meet with the people donating the $200.
Right.
You just have to give them a reason to keep doing it.
Right.
And Republicans are going to keep giving them reasons to do it, but that's harder to do when Republicans are in the minority. So if they're in the majority, they've got to be seen doing stuff.
And Sinema, to whom is she beholden?
She's an interesting bird. She's somebody that I talked to her a bunch when she was first elected. She was still kind of fairly progressive as a House member when she elected 2012 or 2014. As she gradually moved right, I noticed I was hearing less and less from her. And now I haven't talked to her in years. She was a Black Bloc protester. She was like, not just Green Party, but like, people skip over the Black Bloc part. So I think she has real experience with some of the most obnoxious elements of the left. And I think there's a good chance that she developed some real contempt for the left, operating in those spaces for that long. She has also seen the left as a completely marginal entity that can easily be smashed and ignored. If you combine the contempt with a lack of fear of the left, you could explain some of her evolution that way. She has talked openly.
Like a window.
She's talked openly about when she got to the Arizona legislature. She had all these big ideas about what she was going to get done, and then realized she couldn't, so just started working with Republicans. And since then, she's almost exclusively kind of organized with Republicans, yet stayed a Democrat, and I think stayed a Democrat too long to switch parties, because we're so deep into polarization. Maybe not. Like, if she switched and fully embraced Trump, I think she'd be welcomed into the fold. I mean, she raises money like a complete beast. Her fundraising is completely, top shelf for a corporate Democrat, and she puts a lot of energy into fundraising, and a couple of her fundraisers have leaked, and she's a different person at those fundraisers, just obsequious and open, and just having a great time with the K Street and corporate set. So I mean, so that's who she is now, and they are deathly opposed to the the corporate tax increases and the increases in the personal income taxes on the rich. We reported on how she did an internship at this winery that's owned by Bill Price, who you guys probably know, who's like this one of the great private equity barons of our generation or last generation. Like that's her social set is like private equity and like the richest of the rich. And and she grew up very poor. She seems to have exaggerated it to a degree, but still struggled. No doubt about it. And I'm sure there's all kinds of pathologies related to that experience because it affects people in all different kinds of ways. But I mean, the short answer to your question is the super rich.
Yeah, open secrets lists payday lenders, I think, and airlines are two top contributing industries, I think.
That's interesting. Airlines.
Just to shift gears quickly, you did a story recently on the Assange situation. I was a little bit surprised to see Yahoo do that story. I mean, it's a hot story, so I guess you do it if you get it.
It's Isikoff, right? Isikoff and someone else.
Right. It's just it's got to be purely a function of Isikoff, who has just stayed at Yahoo for a very long time. He's a good investigative reporter. I haven't seen anybody. Maybe he's had one, but I'd be interested to see a like Russiagate argument with him because
he's had one. Yeah,
Aaron Mate.
How was it? Because I had, without having seen it, my guess would be he'd say, "Look, I was not a Russiagator. I was reporting on what I was able to get. I wasn't a pundit or commentary member on this."
I've had an exchange with him about this, and to be fair to him, he's like one of the only ones who actually answers questions about it.
Mm-hmm.
He did a whole podcast with Barry Meyer, who wrote that book on fusion, and obviously Isikoff did the first Steele dossier story. He was sort of duped a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's the most generous interpretation of the whole thing. Barry challenged him on it. I think he has made an effort at least to try to say, we got to take a second look at some of this stuff. Like the P tape probably came from this story about a Vegas strip act that was called Hot for Teacher. He's publicly revisited some of those things and answered some questions about it. And his position is basically like, I was told what I was told and it didn't pan out. And I didn't know at the time that the source was, the Clinton campaign, that kind of stuff. So.
But I do think in general, he's a very good reporter with a lot of integrity. I don't know how the Assange story came about, but it's a great piece. They got an extraordinary amount of detail, and the kind of details that make a story sing, like shooting out the wheels of a Russian jet or like a shootout in front of the Ecuadorian embassy, but also like, showed how serious Pompeo was about this operation, which he succeeded in. And I mean, he hasn't completely succeeded in. He didn't kidnap the guy. He's booted out of the Ecuadorian embassy and he's being, tortured in like solitary in Belmarsh. Even though he hasn't been extradited to the United States, I'm sure Pompeo is ghoulishly, satisfied.
I mean, I guess he can, in this environment, it's easier to spin that story as, well, this is the Trump administration, it's Pompeo, he's a bad guy. So whereas the standard issue injustices against Julian Assange story don't tend to get a lot of play, right? So
and the story didn't get much play.
Yeah, could you summarize the highlights from the story as you reported on the reporting?
Yeah, the highlights were that the CIA and for years, beginning in the Obama administration, was looking for all sorts of creative ways that they could get at or kidnap or battle Julian Assange, and specifically in WikiLeaks more generally. That ramped up in 2017 when when WikiLeaks got a hold of Vault 7, which was the CIA's, evidence of the CIA's hacking tools. And the CIA, as I think Isikoff notes this in the story, but the CIA had always kind of laughed at the State Department for losing all of its cables and laughed at the Defense Department for not being able to keep evidence of its war crimes secret. And then here is the CIA losing its hacking tools.
They got pantsed in that thing. Yeah.
They got totally pantsed. And it was barely a story in 2017, but he exposed this multi-billion-dollar surveillance, spying and cyber operation.
Not even just spying; it's also about sort of
hacking
cyber faking.
Just wild stuff that extremely dangerous, and they obviously lost control of it, which is rule number one of what you're not supposed to do if you create extremely dangerous tools that, if let loose on the world, have a capacity to bring it down. And so they got pantsed, and now they're like, okay, now we need like blood. Like that embarrassment took them up another notch. And so then Pompeo told them, take the gloves off and think outside the box and let me deal with the lawyers. And so they came up with all of these different schemes. WikiLeaks posted video from December 2017 of what they said was a grab team outside of the Ecuadorian embassy. And if you look at the infrared video, it's like, yeah, it looks like a grab team to me. It's like four dudes in a sedan, like reading documents that, if you zero in on them, do seem to be related to that. And also, like, what four dudes just sit outside in a sedan like at 2 a.m. like reading documents?
Mob that didn't happen,
Yes, there's supposed to be 20 cars,
right?
And they only got called off last minute.
They were going to do "you can't touch this" in front of the Ecuadorian embassy,
but it hasn't gotten much traction, and which has allowed the Biden administration to just kind of ignore it and continue their extradition effort against Assange. Like the idea that you could be exposed as plotting to assassinate or kidnap a person and then fail at that, and instead go the extradition route, and the judge not just toss that out immediately, is horrifying. And it's also emboldening autocrats all over the world,
right? Yeah,
who are like, you don't like the way I treat my journalists? Well, what about you,
right?
And what you're doing with Assange, which,
like the president of Azerbaijan, right?
Right. Like who is genuinely like a thug launching a crackdown, and BBC presses him on it, and he's like, well, what about Assange?
Yeah.
And you're like, shit. Yeah.
Right. They got us.
I mean, they did toss. They didn't toss it out, right? They refused the extradition,
and then the U.S. appealed it.
Right.
Yeah. So right now the U.S. is appealing it.
Yeah, which is, again, guys, liberals out there who may not watch the show, but if you are, don't you get it? This is your chance to side with the Obama team. Biden, this is your chance to side with Obama over Trump. Don't understand why you're doing this.
I mean, I know this is an obvious question, but we spent a lot of the earlier part of this interview talking about basically how the whole party, Democratic Party, seems to be moving, I guess you would call it, to the left, like in terms of domestic policy. But on this stuff, on the national security stuff, it's like crickets. Like what there's no movement at all, right? Like we don't see it in the op-ed pages.
Mm-hmm.
We don't see it on television. Like we barely see it anywhere. Like to what do you attribute that? I mean, I know that's a subject that's come up before, but
even on Afghanistan, the left, like the Squad, those folks, like they did not really have Biden's back when things were looking ugly for a couple days, in Afghanistan. Hello.
That's a symbol of the chaos in Afghanistan.
I think they're responding to pressures that they're hearing back home. And I think Bernie Sanders himself is a very internationalist leftist, but his campaign was very much about domestic policy in 2016. And I think a lot of the kind of progressive left, that of the last 10, 15 years has been very domestic focused. There was obviously a huge anti-war movement, but we seem so far removed from that at this point. And so I don't think there's a whole lot of pressure on them. Like I doubt that Jamal Bowman got many calls at all over, or AOC calls at all over Iron Dome funding. Like
Yeah, I
it's
was
just
gonna-
it's something that exists as a thing online, but there's not much by way of kind of on the ground energy around it. And I think that allows them to just ignore it.
Why did AOC vote present on the Iron Dome?
I mean, reading between the lines of her explanation, she's saying that the kind of pro-Israel community back in her district was furious and freaking out, and was like unwilling to even like have any dialogue with pro-Palestinian community. And she thought that if by voting present, then she could facilitate some dialogue. That's what I got out of that statement.
But it's not like people who are quote unquote pro-Israel were happy with the present vote.
They were probably happier than with a no vote, but you're right. But that's very true. And how happy are they if after your present vote you say, well, I actually really wanted to vote no.
Right.
It's like, what?
Yeah.
You kind of defeat, if your purpose was to like pander to them.
Yeah.
And then you probably shouldn't say out loud, well, I was just pandering to you, but I really was against it.
Yeah.
But maybe they just really care about a roll call vote. I don't know.
That was.
I mean, I think she's said like she screwed it up. Like
there was that's what she should just say probably.
Yeah, and it's something
the micro and the macro is a little confusing.
And she voted present on that police funding,
right?
Capitol Police funding bill too, and that vote mattered. Like this other vote didn't matter.
It was it didn't matter in terms of numbers whether it was going to pass.
Right, it passed. It was
the other one did.
Right, and her present vote, along with Tlaib and was it Jamal Bowman? I don't remember. There were three who voted present and allowed it to. Those three allowed it to pass. You know, in those cases, it was too easy to push her around at the last minute. And if she wants to become president or whatever, you know, like you can't be pushed around at the last minute because there's a lot of pressure and a lot of people pushing you around.
Last question for me. I mean, I know you've been involved in publishing and, you know, some entrepreneurial stuff and on the media side. Just, do you have any general thoughts about what's going on with the commercial media? Any trends there? Like, obviously the cable's had a tough time recently, like viewership seems to be down. Is that just a normal post-election year thing, or is there something actually going on there?
Well, I mean, cable seems done, though we'll survive for probably the rest of our lives.
Right.
But just in a shrinking form, partly because I forget who was tutoring me about this, but like news and live sports are like the two remaining things that advertisers can put up ads against, because you can't DVR it and just jump the ads and or binge it or whatever. Like what good are ads on Netflix? Like just skip right over them. And so for that reason, even if the audience is small, like news and live sports are a way to reach people with those ads, and especially as it becomes clearer and clearer that the digital media companies and social media companies are just lying so blatantly about, you know, who's watching their ads. But I don't really know many people. I don't think I know any people under, say, like 45 or 50 who like actually watch cable news.
Oh, and the numbers bear that out. I mean, like the average viewer for all of them is like over 60, right?
They're not picking up new ones. I don't know how streaming services like Peacock are going to do. They'll probably produce some, you know, viral clips here and there, but people do seem to be gravitating much more toward independent podcasts, and not just independent podcasts. The Daily is, you know, killing it. But you know, these kind of standalone projects like, you know, podcasts and YouTube shows. I've got my own podcast that I'm doing, so I got you know, fingers in all of these pots.
Tell us about your podcast.
Through the Intercept, I took over. So Mehdi was doing Deconstructed, and about a year ago he left to go to Peacock, actually,
right?
Which is the NBC kind of streaming spinoff. So it's a weekly kind of news podcast. So those seem to be where it's going. And then, you know, individual writers like you guys on Substack. I'm on Substack as well, but not as a, like, it's not how I'm making my living, but I like being on Substack just in case. Like, I'm somebody who always thinks the world's about to fall apart.
You're a realist.
what I mean. Yeah. So it does. I don't see how things get pulled back together again.
So we're gonna remain basically in this weird, like, atomized information landscape, right?
Yeah,
Like that.
Which really lets power off the hook in a dangerous way, because you can have an entire, as long as like the media let's say the media aligned with Democrats don't want to talk about, let's say, Hunter Biden. If they don't talk about it, then it doesn't matter to like that party. Like they can just walk right past it. We started seeing that maybe, during the Obama years, where Fox was ginning up all of these scandals, like Solyndra, then Fast and Furious, and a couple others, that where the rest of the media was like, no, like we're not interested. These are not actually scandals. We're not going to do these. Yet they Benghazi, like they did 4 years of Benghazi, and they would still be doing Benghazi. And they'll do Benghazi watch if they take, some subcommittee at least will do a Benghazi hearing if they take control of the House. Like 10-year anniversary, they'll be doing it. So they kept doing it, and the left and the Democrats ignored it. And now they ignore actual scandals. At the Intercept, we broke some news about some grant that had gone to the lab in Wuhan, that clearly was gain of function research, and showed that, like, didn't show that it came out of that coronavirus came out of that lab, but it showed that assertions that we had not funded that kind of research in that lab were untrue. And on the right, it just like dominated the news cycle for days, and there's basically nothing on the Democratic side. So if the Democrats just decide that they don't want to talk about something, and CNN and MSNBC and the Times kind of go along with it,
and the platforms
and the platforms, although the traffic on the story was monstrous, so the platforms were still sharing it,
right?
But it didn't break through to the kind of liberal, progressive, whatever you would call MSNBC, right, CNN, New York Times,
neoliberal.
And so if it doesn't break through to that, then Democratic politicians feel like they don't have to respond to it.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of not responding to things, last question from me. Can you just talk about the Steve Donziger case, what the latest in that is, and why you think the media is so silent on it?
Right. Yeah. Speaking of abuses of power that the media ignores, and at least in that case, you've had a handful of Democrats start to say something. Like, but that's how sad this situation is, that like you get a couple crumbs from like a couple House members, and you're like celebrating, right? He's a human rights attorney, or was a human rights attorney, and disbarred now from in New York, who won a $9 billion verdict against Chevron for Chevron killing people in Ecuador, with knowing that its own negligence was going to lead to calamitous consequences for indigenous people in the area, and going ahead with the behavior anyway, because it would have been slightly more expensive for them not to do that. And so he wins, he wins this, he and a group of other lawyers, they win this verdict. And Chevron, it would have been much cheaper for them to just pay it, and their stock price probably go up. That's what happens when you pay settlements now. Your stock price goes up, because now the problem is solved, and boom, you get a little bump, and the bump, you write the $9 billion off your profits, so you don't pay taxes on it. You get a nice bump, make your $9 billion right back. You can even buy your stock right beforehand, because the settlement's coming.
Right.
Everybody wins. So there is a playbook for how Chevron could have handled that. They didn't. Instead, they just went to war with Donziger, and got this judge to come after Donziger, accusing him of corruption, saying that he had somehow rigged this verdict against them, because it couldn't possibly be the case that Chevron had actually done all of these things. And so they ordered him to turn over his various pieces of equipment. He refused. He was hit with contempt for refusing the judge's order. Spent nearly 800 days in home detention. Finally, on last Friday, he gets sentenced. The judge tells him, you need a 2x4 between the eyes to start respecting the rule of law, and sentences him to 6 additional months which the UN Human Rights Commission had just said the day before is a human rights violation. Like you can't. How do you keep somebody in prison for 2 years on a charge, the maximum of which is 6 months, and then when they finally get sentenced, you give them the 6 months anyway? It's like the most outrageous abuse of power.
Where's MSNBC? I thought they didn't like when the rule of law was was thrown out.
That's right. Get James Comey on to.
Yeah, no one's. I mean, not to state the obvious, but like, there's been no coverage of that outside of a handful of shows.
Well,
Breaking Point.
Chevron is one of the biggest, sponsors of programs. I've seen it. Like we've covered it a couple of times at Rising. I was watching one once, and a Chevron ad was the pre-roll because on YouTube you don't pick those because and it can be different every time. But I was like, it's a good one.
Wow.
No, so someone will make a straight to Netflix film about it, and Donziger will make like $8,000 in the option, and everyone, it'll be a happy ending.
He's going to like a serious. I mean, he's scheduled to go to a serious prison too.
Yeah, that place is awful. That's the one where the assistant attorney general, deputy attorney general visited recently and left, and like a week later, like announced plans that it's closing. Like that's how bad that prison is.
Which one?
It was the one in Manhattan.
Yeah. No, it's the one in Brooklyn.
It was the one in Brooklyn. I mean, they're both awful.
Yeah. Which awful prison is it?
All right, Ryan, thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. Great stuff
much.
On the reconciliation. Like, just really, really quickly, what percentage of people in the news media who have commented about the bill would you say know what's in it?
The way that it depends. So of the Capitol Hill reporters, they all know half-page outline.
Okay.
They know it's, universal pre-K, elder care. They can tell you like next layer down types of things. On cable, probably very little, other than that it's 3.5 trillion and includes some child stuff and maybe the community college thing because it's easy to remember. But that's probably about it.
I wonder.
On some climate stuff. We know there's some climate stuff.
It's just been interesting to watch so many people talk about it and sort of talk around the specifics of it.
And I've heard some people say like it is obviously it's a media failing. But from a tactical perspective, it might be that the media's approach to it has been a gift to it, because the more the media would cover it, the more they'd screw it up and the more they'd fearmonger around what's in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that it just moved quietly through Congress for months without them paying a bit of attention to it, because nothing rates worse than talking about infrastructure.
Right.
And it was lumped in with infrastructure, allowed it to get so close to passage. And now they're just talking about the horse race part of it. So they haven't had a chance to kind of fearmonger around it. Like the Sanders campaign through December, completely ignored. And that was the Sanders campaign strategy through heading into Iowa. Like they were like, we might, we can, because they knew like once MSNBC like trained it and New York Times trained its full fire on them, that they were going to take a withering beating, because half of the primary voters are New York Times readers and MSNBC watchers.
Right.
And so the longer they could stave that off, the better.
Right.
As you referred to in a very good video you did.
Yes. I heard later from Faz, he watched that and he was like, damn it, this is the strategy.
Yeah.
What are you doing saying it out loud?
All right, Ryan, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
And where can people find you?
Listen to Deconstructed. I work hard on it, so people will like it.
Sounds good. We will check you out there and at the Intercept and all other places. So thanks for coming by.
All right, thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Ryan.
See you guys.
Bye.
That was interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting. You seem to learn something, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, it's a process of discovery for me. I can't tell why I hate this story so much. I hate it. I don't know why. Something about it bothers me. Not sure what that is yet exactly.
Speaking of Isikoff, by the way, and Russiagate, highly recommend the video of him, an interview that Aaron Mate did with him about the Assange story. It's really funny because he keeps saying stuff about Russia and Aaron's like, allegedly. And he's like, I'm not going to say allegedly. He's like, okay. And then he keeps going. He's like, allegedly. No, they're having this like little debate in between.
Aaron
The
did a thing
discussion.
with Isikoff,
Yeah, about the Assange thing.
the new one.
Yes.
Interesting. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, it's a funny dynamic.
I would have
they
thought that
agree to
Isikoff
disagree.
would have avoided Aaron like the plague.
No, I mean they've had I think that he's been on the show before.
Interesting. Interesting.
Isikoff does seem to be much kind of atypically honest. Maybe he'll come on our
can
show.
he? Yeah, we should invite him on.
Michael, if you're watching, I'll keep Matt in line. I'll shut him up about Russiagate.
Right. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we learned a lot. You know, Katie, I learned something today about
What did you learn?
reconciliation.
About reconciliation.
Yeah.
About Trump, Schumer. Well, why do I say Trump sometimes when I mean Biden or Schumer? About Schumer's strategy.
Right. Yeah. We learned something real. So that was cool. Well, that was great. So thanks for tuning in. We're obviously doing a few different things this week. Let us know what you think about that in the comments.
Nicely. Politely.
No, you don't have to be polite. Tell us what you really feel.
Yeah. Be polite to me. Be rude to Matt.
Okay. And we will see you again on Monday morning.
YouTube.com/usefulidiots.
All right. See you then.
All right. Hello. Thank you so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For full episodes and extended interviews, please subscribe at usefulidiots.substack.com. You can subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/usefulidiots for clips, live streams, and full episodes. Also, subscribe to us wherever you find your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod and use the hashtag UsefulIdiotsPod. Join us Mondays at 10 a.m. for the Useful Idiots Monday Morning Show, where we discuss the Sunday morning news shows so you don't have to watch them.